The gunshot cracked through the desert air like thunder, and Jake Easton's horse reared beneath him as a woman's voice cut through the canyon with words that would change his life forever. Jake had been tracking a cattle rustler through the New Mexico territory for 3 days when he'd heard the commotion ahead. His hand went instinctively to his rifle as he urged his mare forward, expecting trouble. What he found instead was a woman kneeling in the red dirt, her body curved protectively over something small and rust-colored, her dark hair wild around her shoulders as she stared up at 2 mounted men with eyes that blazed like green fire. "I said back away," she repeated, her voice steady despite the tremor Jake could see running through her hands. The 2 riders wore dusty trail clothes, and one held his pistol aimed lazily in her direction. "Lady, that fox has been raiding our chicken coops for a week now. We got every right to put it down. It's injured and frightened," the woman shot back. "Killing it would be murder for spite, nothing more." The second rider laughed, a cruel sound that made Jake's jaw tighten. "It's a fox, not a person. Now move aside before you get hurt." The woman didn't budge. Instead, she spread her arms wider, sheltering the animal beneath her. "If you harm it, you harm me too. That's how this works." Jake had seen his share of standoffs in his 32 years, but something about this woman's fierce protection of a wild creature struck him deep in his chest. He nudged his horse forward, making his presence known with a deliberate clearing of his throat. All 3 heads swiveled toward him. The woman's eyes widened slightly as she took in his marshal's badge, catching the September sunlight. The 2 men straightened in their saddles, suddenly wary. "Gentlemen," Jake said, keeping his tone conversational though his hand rested near his sidearm. "Seems like a lot of fuss over one small fox." "Marshal," the first rider said, his gun slowly lowering. "This woman's protecting vermin that's been stealing from honest folk." Jake guided his mare closer, studying the scene with careful attention. The fox lay nearly motionless beneath the woman's protective crouch, its russet fur matted with blood along one hind leg. Its amber eyes were wide with fear and pain, and it made no move to attack or flee. Just a frightened animal, wounded and cornered. "Looks to me like that fox won't be raiding anything for a good while," Jake observed. "If ever, that leg's torn up pretty bad." "All the more reason to put it out of its misery," the second rider argued. "Or," Jake said, his voice taking on an edge of steel, "you could let the lady tend to an injured creature and go on about your business. Unless you're looking to explain to Judge Morrison why you threatened a woman with a firearm over livestock that's still very much alive and accounted for." The 2 men exchanged glances. The threat was clear enough. Judge Morrison had little patience for men who bullied women, regardless of the circumstances. "This ain't over," the first rider muttered, but he holstered his weapon. "That fox better not show its face near our property again." "I imagine it won't," Jake said evenly. "Safe travels, gentlemen." He watched them ride away, dust rising from their horses' hooves, until they disappeared around the red rock formations that dotted the landscape. Only then did he dismount and approach the woman, moving slowly so as not to spook either her or the injured animal. Up close, she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 24 or 25, with sun-bronzed skin and freckles scattered across her nose. Her dress was simple calico, worn but clean, and her hands were scraped raw, likely from scrambling over rocks to reach the fox. "Thank you," she said quietly, not moving from her protective position. "Though I would have stood my ground regardless." "I don't doubt that for a second," Jake replied, crouching down to her level but keeping a respectful distance. "Jake Easton, United States Marshal out of Santa Fe." "Thea Winters," she said, her eyes still on the fox. I have a small homestead about 2 miles north of here. I was checking my traps when I heard this one crying out. Looks like it got caught in something, maybe a coyote trap that broke free. Jake could see the cruel teeth marks now, digging into the fox's leg where metal had bitten deep. That needs tending. You know anything about doctoring animals? Thea's chin lifted slightly. I've patched up everything from horses to rabbits. Lost my father 2 years back and the homestead's been mine since. You learn to tend to living things when you're alone. There was no self-pity in her voice, just simple fact. Jake found himself respecting that straightforward honesty. I can help you get it back to your place, he offered. If you trust a stranger, that is. Thea studied him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face as if reading the truth of him written there. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. The fox might not take kindly to being moved, she warned. Even injured, they can bite something fierce. I've got a blanket in my saddlebag, Jake said, rising to retrieve it. We can wrap it carefully, keep it from thrashing too much. Working together with quiet efficiency, they managed to bundle the frightened fox into the thick wool blanket. It snapped once at Jake's hand, but he'd expected that and pulled back in time. Thea murmured soft, soothing sounds the whole while, her voice gentle as falling snow. "Easy now, little one," she whispered. "Nobody's going to hurt you, I promise." The fox seemed to understand something in her tone, or perhaps it was simply too weak to fight anymore. It settled into the blanket's warmth, though its eyes remained alert and wary. Jake secured the bundle carefully in front of his saddle while Thea mounted her own horse, a sturdy paint mare that had been ground tied nearby. As they rode north together, the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the New Mexico landscape in shades of gold and crimson. "You always make a habit of standing between guns and wild animals?" Jake asked, genuinely curious. Thea glanced at him, a hint of amusement softening her serious expression. "Only when the alternative is watching something defenseless get killed for no good reason. That fox wasn't hurting anyone, not in its current state. Those men just wanted to feel powerful, wanted to kill something because they could. And you couldn't abide that." "No," she said simply. "I couldn't." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the steady clip of hooves on hard, packed earth and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Jake found himself watching Thea from the corner of his eye, noting the easy way she sat her horse, the capable set of her shoulders. She wasn't like the women he usually encountered in Santa Fe's drawing rooms and social gatherings. There was something untamed about her, something as wild and honest as the land itself. Her homestead appeared as they crested a low rise, a modest cabin built of rough-hewn logs with a small barn and corral nearby. A vegetable garden stretched along the south side of the cabin, and Jake could see the careful attention that had gone into the place. Everything was neat and orderly, the fence rails straight, the roof recently patched. A woman living alone had to be twice as capable as anyone else, and Thea clearly was. "You can bring the fox into the barn," Thea said, dismounting quickly. "I've got a stall there I use for sick animals sometimes." Jake followed her instructions, carrying the blanket-wrapped bundle carefully. The barn was dim and cool inside, smelling of hay and horse and leather. Thea had already prepared a thick bed of straw in one of the stalls, and Jake laid the fox down gently. "I'll need to clean the wound," Thea said, moving with practiced efficiency to gather supplies from a shelf. "Might want to step back. This won't be pleasant for anyone involved." But Jake stayed, holding the fox steady through the blanket while Thea worked. Her hands were gentle but sure as she cleaned the mangled leg with water she'd heated over a small fire. The fox whimpered and struggled weakly, But Jake kept his grip firm and Thea never faltered. "You're good at this," he observed, watching her wind clean cloth around the leg with neat precision. "Had plenty of practice," she replied, not looking up from her work. "Father used to say that any creature willing to fight for its life deserves a chance to keep it. I guess that stuck with me. He sounds like he was a good man." "The best," Thea said softly, and Jake heard the grief still raw in those two words. "He was thrown from a horse during a storm, broke his neck, was gone before I could even get to him. I'm sorry." She tied off the bandage and sat back on her heels, finally meeting his eyes. "Life out here doesn't leave much room for being sorry. You survive or you don't. You keep going or you give up. I chose to keep going." The fox had gone still, its breathing shallow but steady. Thea stroked its head gently, her touch feather light. "Will it live?" Jake asked. "Maybe," Thea said. "Depends on whether infection sets in, whether it has the will to heal. But I've done what I can for now." They left the fox to rest and stepped out into the fading light. Jake should have been riding on, should have been getting back to tracking his rustler or heading into the nearest town. Instead, he found himself accepting when Thea offered him coffee and a place to water his horse. Her cabin was small but clean, with windows that let in the last golden rays of sunlight. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and simple furniture filled the space, everything handmade but sturdy. Jake could see books on a shelf, more than he would have expected, and a half-finished piece of needlework folded neatly on a chair. Thea poured coffee from a pot on the stove, the smell rich and welcome after the long day. They sat at her small table, the silence between them comfortable in a way that surprised Jake. He'd always been a solitary man by nature, his work as a marshal keeping him moving from place to place, never settling long enough to form real connections. But something about Thea's quiet competence, her fierce independence, drew him in ways he hadn't expected. "How long have you been marshalling?" she asked, wrapping her hands around her own cup. "Going on 8 years now," Jake replied. "Started as a deputy in Texas, worked my way up. Seemed like the right fit for someone who couldn't stay in one place too long." "You don't strike me as a restless man," Thea observed. "More like someone who hasn't found a reason to stop moving yet." Her perceptiveness caught him off guard. "Maybe you're right about that. What brings you out this way? Surely there's more pressing matters for a marshal than playing referee over a fox." Jake smiled slightly. "I was tracking a cattle rustler who's been hitting ranches between here and Albuquerque. Lost his trail yesterday, figured I'd swing by Wyatt to see if anyone had spotted him." "Wyatt's another 10 miles northeast," Thea said. "You could have kept riding." "I could have," Jake agreed, holding her gaze. "But then I heard gunshots and a woman's voice, and something told me I needed to see what was happening." Thea looked down at her coffee, but not before Jake saw the faint color rise in her cheeks. "Well, I'm glad you listened to that something. Those men might have gotten mean if you hadn't shown up. You didn't seem too worried about them getting mean." "Worried and willing to back down are two different things," she said firmly. "I meant what I said. If they'd harmed that fox, they'd have had to go through me first." "Why?" Jake asked, leaning forward slightly. "I understand compassion for an injured animal, but you were ready to take a bullet for a fox. That's more than just kindness." Thea was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. When she spoke, her voice was soft but intense. "When my father died, I was completely alone out here. No family, no close neighbors, nothing but this homestead and the work that came with it. The first winter nearly broke me. I was so lonely I thought I might go mad from the silence. Then one day, a doe showed up near my cabin, half-starved and limping from a wolf bite. I brought her food, tended her wounds, and she stayed close all winter. She wasn't a pet, wasn't tame, but she was there. a living thing that needed me, that I could help. It reminded me that I wasn't completely alone, that life still mattered even when it felt like nothing did. She looked up, and Jake saw a depth of feeling in her eyes that made his chest tighten. I guess I learned then that protecting something vulnerable, something that can't protect itself, that's what keeps us human. That's what keeps the darkness from winning. So no, I won't stand by and watch something helpless get killed, not when I can do something to stop it. Not ever. Jake set down his coffee cup, his throat suddenly tight. He'd met plenty of brave men in his years as a marshal, men who'd faced down outlaws and hostile territory without flinching. But he'd never met anyone with the kind of courage Thea possessed, the courage to stay soft in a hard world, to protect the vulnerable even at cost to herself. "You're remarkable," he said quietly, the words inadequate but true. Thea shook her head, but a small smile touched her lips. "I'm just stubborn. Ask anyone in Wyatt, they'll tell you. I'm starting to think stubbornness might be underrated." They talked as the sun set and stars began to appear through the windows, the conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. Jake learned that Thea had come to New Mexico from Missouri with her father when she was 16, that she could read Latin and Greek, thanks to her father's education, that she'd taught herself to shoot and rope and break horses because the alternative was failing. She asked him about his work, about the places he'd been, and listened with genuine interest as he described the sprawling territory he covered, the people he'd helped, the justice he'd tried to serve. By the time Jake finally rose to leave, the moon had climbed high and silver, casting long shadows across the land. Thea walked him out to where his horse waited, the night air cool and sweet with sage. "I should check on the fox before I go," Jake said, though part of him knew he was just looking for an excuse to stay longer. They walked to the barn together, Thea carrying a lantern that threw warm light across the straw-strewn floor. The fox was awake when they peered into the stall, its amber eyes reflecting the lantern light. It had managed to lap up some of the water Thea had left, and while it still looked weak, there was something defiant in the way it watched them. "Fighter," Thea murmured approvingly. "That's good. Fighters survive." "Like you," Jake said. She glanced at him, and in the lantern light her face was soft and lovely, all the fierce edges gentled by shadows. "Maybe like both of us." Jake knew he should go. Knew he should mount up and ride to Wyatt, find a room for the night, get back to his work. But standing here in the quiet barn with Thea beside him and the fox watching them with its wild eyes, he felt something shift inside him, something that had been locked tight for years beginning to open. "I'll come back tomorrow," he heard himself say. "Check on the fox, make sure those men don't come back to cause trouble." "You don't have to do that," Thea said, but her eyes were hopeful. "I know," Jake replied, "but I want to." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her whole face, and Jake felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. He rode away from her homestead with the moon lighting his path, but his mind stayed behind, full of green eyes and gentle hands and the fierce declaration that had first caught his attention. "If you harm it, you harm me too." It was the statement of someone who understood that all vulnerability deserved protection. That strength meant standing between the helpless and harm, regardless of the cost. Jake had spent years enforcing the law, bringing order to a wild territory. But he'd never met anyone who embodied justice the way Thea did, not through force or authority, but through simple, stubborn compassion. He made camp a few miles out, too restless to ride all the way to Wyatt, and lay awake watching stars wheel overhead. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow he'd go back, and maybe the day after that too. The rustler could wait a little longer. Some things, Jake was beginning to realize were more important than the chase. Morning came clear and bright. The sky that endless New Mexico blue that seemed to stretch forever. Jake was up with the sun, breaking camp quickly and riding back toward Thea's homestead with an eagerness he couldn't quite explain to himself. He told himself it was concern for the fox, or wanting to make sure those men didn't return to cause trouble. But he knew the truth ran deeper than that. Thea was already up when he arrived, working in her garden with her hair tied back in a practical braid. She looked up at the sound of hooves, shading her eyes against the sun, and smiled when she recognized him. "You're here early," she called out, standing and brushing dirt from her skirt. "Wanted to check on our patient," Jake said, dismounting. "How's it doing? See for yourself." They walked to the barn together, and Jake was pleased to see the fox alert and watchful in its stall. It had eaten the small pieces of dried meat Thea had left, and though it still wouldn't put weight on the injured leg, its eyes were brighter, more aware. "It's stronger," Jake observed. "The will to live is powerful," Thea said, kneeling carefully by the stall. The fox watched her but didn't try to flee, as if it understood somehow that she meant no harm. "I'll change the bandage this afternoon, see how the wound looks, but I think it might actually make it. Thanks to you." "Thanks to both of us," she corrected. "You bought me the time I needed yesterday." They fell into an easy partnership that day, Jake helping Thea with the heavier chores around her homestead. He repaired a section of corral fence that had been worrying her, checked her roof for loose shingles, and helped her move a stubborn water barrel that needed repositioning. Thea, in turn, shared her midday meal with him. Simple food but well prepared, and they talked about everything and nothing as they worked. Jake found himself noticing small details about her throughout the day. The way she hummed softly while working, old songs he half remembered from his childhood. The careful attention she paid to every task, no matter how small. The way she'd pause sometimes to watch a bird in flight or study a particularly beautiful cloud formation, as if beauty mattered just as much as survival. "You see the world differently than most people," he said late in the afternoon, as they took a break in the shade of her cabin. Thea considered this, sipping from the canteen they'd been sharing. "Maybe, or maybe I just have the time to look. When you're working alone, you can't rush through everything. You have to pay attention, notice the details. And once you start noticing, you see how much beauty there is even in hard places." "Is it lonely?" Jake asked. "Being out here by yourself?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "But there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. I have my horses, the wild things that pass through. I have my books and my work, and I have myself, which sounds strange maybe, but I've learned to be good company for myself." "That's not strange," Jake said. "That's rare. Most people can't stand their own company for long." "What about you?" Thea asked, turning the question back on him. "All that traveling, all those miles between places. Are you lonely?" No one had ever asked Jake that before, and the question caught him unprepared. He thought about it honestly, looking out over the New Mexico landscape that stretched away in all directions. "I didn't think I was," he said slowly. "I liked the freedom, like not being tied down, but maybe I was just moving too fast to notice what was missing. And now I'm starting to wonder what it would be like to stop moving, to have a reason to stay somewhere." Their eyes met, and Jake saw understanding there and something warmer, something that made his pulse quicken. The moment was broken by a sound from the barn, a sharp, whimpering cry. They both moved quickly, Jake reaching the stall first. The fox was up, trying to stand on all four legs but collapsing when its injured leg wouldn't bear weight. It was panting heavily, clearly in distress. "Easy," Thea murmured, moving slowly into the stall. "Easy, little one, don't push it yet." But the fox was panicking now, trying desperately to run, to escape. Jake understood, the animal's instincts screaming that it was trapped and vulnerable. Thea reached for it carefully, but it snapped at her hand, fear making it aggressive. "Let me," Jake said, pulling off his coat and using it like he'd used the blanket the day before, getting the thick fabric between himself and the fox's teeth. He managed to bundle the struggling animal carefully, holding it secure but not tight enough to hurt. "Talk to it," he said to Thea. "Like you did yesterday." Thea immediately began her soft, soothing murmurs, and gradually the fox stopped fighting. Jake could feel its rapid heartbeat through the coat, feel the terror vibrating through its small body. But Thea's voice worked like magic, and slowly, the animal calmed. "There," Thea whispered. "Nobody's going to hurt you. You're safe here." They stayed like that for long minutes, Jake holding the fox while Thea gentled it with her voice and carefully stroked its head. Finally, it relaxed enough that Jake could set it back down on the straw. It immediately curled into a tight ball, exhausted by its panic. "It's afraid," Thea said softly. "Afraid of being trapped, of being helpless. I understand that feeling." "When your father died," Jake said, understanding dawning, "you felt trapped by circumstances, helpless against what life threw at you." She nodded, her hand still resting lightly on the fox's back. "For a while, yes. It took time to realize that survival is its own kind of power. That choosing to keep going, choosing to care about things even when it hurts, that's not helplessness. That's strength." Jake looked at this remarkable woman kneeling in the straw, her dress dusty and her hair coming loose from its braid, and felt something click into place inside him. This was what he'd been moving too fast to see, this connection, this understanding between two people who'd both learned to survive alone but were beginning to realize they didn't have to anymore. "Thea," he said quietly, and she looked up at him with those green eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "I think I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "I came back this morning telling myself it was about the fox, about making sure you were safe. But that wasn't the whole truth. I came back because I wanted to see you, because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since yesterday. And I know that's fast. No, we barely know each other, but I also know I've never felt like this before." Thea stood slowly, brushing straw from her skirt, her expression unreadable. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd faced down armed outlaws with less fear than he felt right now, waiting for her to respond. "Jake," she said finally, and his name in her voice sounded like something precious. "I'm not good at this, at letting people in, at trusting. I've been alone so long that I'd almost convinced myself I preferred it that way. But then you showed up yesterday, and you didn't just help me protect that fox. You understood why I had to protect it. You saw something in me that most people think is foolishness or weakness, and you valued it instead." She took a step closer to him, and then another, until they were nearly touching. "So if you're saying what I think you're saying, if you're feeling what I'm feeling, then yes. Yes, I want to see where this goes. But you need to know that I can't be someone I'm not. I can't leave this place, can't abandon the life I've built. And I won't stop caring about wounded things, won't stop standing between them and harm." "I wouldn't want you to," Jake said, lifting his hand slowly to cup her cheek. She leaned into the touch, and his thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "Your fierce heart is exactly what drew me to you. That and about 100 other things I'm still discovering." "What about your work?" Thea asked. "You're a marshal. You have responsibilities, territory to cover." "Territory that includes this area," Jake pointed out. "And maybe it's time I thought about settling somewhere instead of always moving on. Maybe I could base myself out of Wyatt, still do my work but have a place to come back to, a person to come back to." "That's a lot to change for someone you just met." "It is," Jake agreed, but sometimes you just know. My mother used to say that the heart recognizes what the mind takes time to understand. I think my heart recognized you the moment I heard you say you'd stand between that fox and anyone who'd harm it. Thea smiled, that transforming smile that made her whole face light up. Your mother sounds wise. She was, Jake said softly. Died when I was 20. I think she would have liked you. I wish I could have met her. Me too. They stood there in the quiet barn with the afternoon light slanting through the gaps in the walls and the fox sleeping peacefully nearby. And Jake felt more at home than he had anywhere in years. This moment, this woman, this life beginning to take shape around them, this was what he'd been searching for without knowing it. He leaned down slowly, giving Thea every chance to pull away, and kissed her softly. Her lips were warm and tasted of coffee and sunshine, and when she kissed him back, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, Jake felt like he'd found something he hadn't even known he'd lost. The days that followed established a rhythm that felt natural as breathing. Jake did ride into Wyatt and rent a room at the boarding house there. And he did send telegrams to his superiors explaining that he was basing his operations out of this area for the foreseeable future. But every day found him at Thea's homestead, helping with the work, checking on the fox, and simply being with her. They talked about everything as they worked side by side. Jake told her about his childhood in Texas, about the older brother he'd lost to fever, about becoming a lawman because he'd wanted to protect people the way no one had been able to protect his brother. Thea shared stories about her mother, who died when she was young, about traveling west with her father and falling in love with the raw beauty of New Mexico, about learning to be strong because the alternative was breaking. The fox continued to heal, day by day growing stronger. Thea changed its bandages daily, and Jake helped hold it steady while she worked. The creature never became tame exactly, but it seemed to understand that they meant no harm. Sometimes Jake would find Thea in the barn just sitting near the stall, reading aloud from one of her books while the fox watched her with alert, intelligent eyes. "What are you reading?" he asked one evening, settling down beside her in the straw. "Greek myths," Thea said, showing him the worn volume. "This one's about Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods to give to humanity. He was punished for it, chained to a rock, but he never regretted helping those who couldn't help themselves." "Sounds familiar," Jake said with a smile, and Thea laughed. "I suppose I do identify with the sentiment, though I hope my punishment won't be quite so severe." "Not while I'm around," Jake promised, and meant it with everything in him. 3 weeks after they'd first met, Jake was helping Thea repair her chicken coop when riders appeared on the horizon. Thea's hand went still on the hammer she'd been using, her body tensing. "It's them," she said quietly. "The men from before." Jake straightened, his hand going automatically to the gun at his hip. There were 3 riders this time, the original 2 plus another man Jake didn't recognize. They rode up to the homestead with deliberate slowness, spreading out slightly in a way that made Jake's instincts prickle with warning. "Afternoon," the first rider called out, the same one who'd held his gun on Thea before. "Heard the marshal's been spending considerable time out here. Wanted to check on how that fox was doing." "It's healing," Thea said, moving to stand beside Jake. "Not that it's any of your concern." "See, that's where you're wrong," the third man said. He was older than the other 2, with hard eyes and a cruel mouth. "That fox has become our concern. Word's gotten around about how you protected it, how the marshal here backed you up. Some folks are starting to think maybe you got some kind of claim on wild animals now, that we can't protect our property from vermin." "That's ridiculous," Jake said evenly. "One injured fox doesn't set any kind of precedent." "Maybe not to you," the man said. "But we're here to make sure everyone understands. We want that fox handed over. We'll finish what we started, nice and legal-like." "No," Thea said, her voice flat and hard. "That animal is healing on my property under my protection. You have no legal right to it." "We have the right to protect our livestock," the second rider argued. "Your livestock that's still alive and well," Jake pointed out. "You want to shoot a fox for crimes it might commit in the future. That's not justice, that's murder." "It's an animal," the older man said contemptuously. "Can't murder an animal." "You can kill something helpless for no good reason," Thea said. "And where I come from, that's murder in any language that matters." The older man's face darkened. "You're getting awful high and mighty for a woman living out here alone. Maybe the marshal won't always be around to protect you." Jake moved then, faster than thought, his gun clearing leather in one smooth motion. He didn't aim it at anyone, just held it ready at his side, but the message was unmistakable. "That sounded an awful lot like a threat," he said, his voice gone cold and flat in a way that had made more than one outlaw reconsider their choices. "And threatening a woman is something I take real personal, so let me make this clear. The fox stays where it is until it's healed enough to be released. Miss Winters is under the protection of the law, which means under my protection. And if anything happens to her or her property, I'll know exactly where to start looking for who's responsible. We clear?" The three men stared at him, weighing their options. Jake had a reputation in the territory, one built on fairness but also on being dangerous when he needed to be. The older man clearly wanted to push harder, but the other two were already backing down, their horses sidling nervously. "This ain't finished," the older man finally said, but he was already turning his horse. "That fox better not set foot on our land." "It won't," Thea said. "When it's healed, I'll release it far from your property. You have my word." They rode away, but Jake kept his hand near his gun until they were out of sight. Only then did he holster the weapon and turn to Thea, who was standing very straight and still, her face pale but composed. "You all right?" he asked gently. "Yes," she said, but her hands were shaking slightly. "I just hate bullies. Hate men who think they can intimidate someone just because they have numbers on their side." "They won't be back," Jake said with certainty. "They're cowards, and cowards don't push when someone pushes back harder." "But you won't always be here," Thea said, echoing the older man's threat. "Eventually you'll have to go back to your regular route, back to covering your territory, and then I'll be alone again." Jake took her hands in his, stilling their trembling. "That's what I've been meaning to talk to you about. I sent another telegram yesterday to my supervisor. Asked for a permanent assignment based out of Wyatt." Thea's eyes widened. "Jake, you can't give up your position for me. We've only known each other a few weeks." "I'm not giving it up," he corrected. "I'm modifying it. This area needs law enforcement just as much as anywhere else. And as for the time, my mother also used to say that some people need years to say what could be said in a moment. Thea, I love you. I think I've loved you since you stood in front of that fox and told armed men they'd have to go through you first. And I want to build a life here with you, if you'll have me." Tears sparkled in Thea's green eyes, but she was smiling. "Jake Easton, are you proposing to me in the middle of my half-repaired chicken coop?" "I suppose I am," Jake said, grinning. "Is that all right?" "It's perfect," Thea said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, of course, yes, I love you too. I think I started loving you the moment you asked me why I'd protect a fox so fiercely, like you actually cared about the answer." Jake pulled her into his arms and kissed her properly, pouring everything he felt into it. Behind them, chickens clucked and scratched in the dirt, and somewhere in the barn, a healing fox rested in the straw. Ordinary things, simple things, but they felt like the whole world to Jake in that moment. They were married 6 weeks later in Wyatt's small church, with half the town in attendance. Jake had worried that Thea might not have friends or community, but he'd underestimated her. The shopkeeper and his wife came, along with several ranch families who knew Thea from her occasional trips to town. The doctor came, an elderly man who told Jake that Thea had once helped him save a rancher's horse, working through the night without complaint. Even Judge Morrison made an appearance, his sharp eyes approving when he shook Jake's hand. "You've got yourself a good woman," the judge said. "Strong spine on that one. We need more like her out here." "Yes, sir," Jake agreed wholeheartedly. Thea wore a simple dress of deep blue that made her eyes shine like emeralds, and she'd woven wildflowers into her hair. She was the most beautiful thing Jake had ever seen, standing beside him in that little church and promising to love him for all the days of their lives. They spent their wedding night at the homestead, now legally theirs together. Jake had already moved most of his things in over the past weeks, and the cabin felt like home in a way nowhere ever had before. They lay together in the darkness afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the night sounds of the desert through the open window. "Tell me something," Thea murmured, her head resting on Jake's chest. "That first day when you heard me telling those men about the fox, did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" "No," Jake admitted, "but some part of me must have hoped. Why else would I have ridden toward the sound of trouble instead of away from it?" "Thank God you did," Thea said softly. "Thank God you're the kind of man who rides toward trouble instead of away. Thank God you're the kind of woman who protects the helpless even when it's dangerous. That's what I fell in love with, you know, that fierce, uncompromising compassion." Thea tilted her head up to kiss him. "We make a good pair, then. You bring justice and I bring mercy." "The world needs both," Jake said, holding her closer. The next morning they went to check on the fox together. It had been nearly 2 months since Jake first found Thea protecting it, and the creature had healed remarkably well. It could put weight on its leg now, could move around the stall with ease. The wound had closed cleanly, leaving only a scar hidden beneath the rust-red fur. "It's time," Thea said, though Jake heard the sadness in her voice. "Time to let it go." They chose a spot several miles from the homestead, far from the properties of the men who'd threatened it, in a canyon where water ran year-round and prey would be plentiful. Jake carried the fox in a wooden crate they'd built for the purpose, and Thea rode beside him in silence, her eyes distant. When they reached the release site, Jake set the crate down carefully and opened the door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, cautiously, the fox emerged. It looked around, testing the air, its amber eyes bright and alert. It took a few limping steps, then a few more. The limp was barely noticeable now, wouldn't slow it down much in the wild. Then it turned and looked back at them, and Jake would have sworn he saw understanding in those wild eyes, maybe even gratitude. "Go on," Thea said softly. "You're free now. Be safe, little one." The fox held her gaze for another heartbeat, then turned and loped away into the canyon, its red coat bright against the brown earth. They watched until it disappeared into the scrub brush, and only then did Thea allow the tears to fall. Jake held her while she cried, understanding that these weren't tears of sadness exactly, but something more complex. Relief that the animal would live, grief at the parting, joy at having made a difference. All the messy, complicated emotions that came with caring deeply about something. "You gave it a second chance," he said when her tears had slowed. "That's everything, Thea." "I know," she said, wiping her eyes. "It's just hard letting go, even when you know it's right." "You're good at doing hard things," Jake reminded her. "That's one of the 1,000 reasons I love you." Life settled into new rhythms after that. Jake worked his territory from a base in Wyatt, riding out for days at a time, but always returning to Thea and their homestead. He caught his cattle rustler finally, A young man more desperate than dangerous who'd been trying to feed his family after a fire destroyed their farm. Jake made sure the man faced justice, but also worked with local ranchers to find him honest work after he'd served his time. That was the kind of lawman he wanted to be, one who balanced punishment with mercy. Thea continued working their land, and Jake helped when he was home. They expanded the garden, added more chickens, and Jake built a better barn to replace the aging structure that had been there before. They worked side by side in comfortable partnership, and Jake discovered that he loved the rhythm of ranch work, loved coming home tired and dusty to find Thea making dinner, loved the simple domesticity of their shared life. Animals came and went through their lives with some regularity. Word had gotten around somehow that Thea Easton was someone who'd help an injured creature, and people started bringing her wounded animals they'd found. An owl with a broken wing, a coyote pup that had lost its mother, a horse that had gotten tangled in barbed wire and was expected to die, but that Thea nursed back to health over weeks of patient care. Jake helped with all of it, learning from Thea's gentle expertise, and found unexpected satisfaction in the work. Each animal they saved felt like a small victory against the hardness of frontier life, a reminder that compassion still mattered even in difficult places. "You know," he said one evening as they treated a young antelope's infected hoof, "when I became a marshal, I thought justice was about catching bad men and putting them in jail. But you've taught me it's more than that. It's about protecting the vulnerable, standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves, whether that's a person or a fox or anything else that needs defending." Thea smiled at him over the antelope's back. "And you've taught me that I don't have to do everything alone. That letting someone in, trusting them to stand beside you, that's not weakness. It's just another kind of strength." A year after their wedding, Thea told Jake she was pregnant. He was out mending fence when she came to find him, her face glowing with joy and nervousness. "Are you sure?" he asked, hardly daring to believe it. "As sure as I can be," she said. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday when I went into Wyatt." Jake dropped his tools and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop. A baby. They were going to have a baby. The thought filled him with a kind of joy so profound it almost frightened him. "I'm going to be a father," he said wonderingly. "A good one," Thea assured him. "The best. You're already so gentle with every creature we help. You'll be wonderful with our child." Jake placed his hand carefully on her still flat stomach, awed by the life beginning there. "Boy or girl doesn't matter, as long as you're both healthy." "We will be," Thea said confidently. "This little one has a fighter for a mother, remember." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter and into spring. Jake reduced his time in the field even more, unwilling to be far from Thea as her time approached. He did the heavier work around the homestead without being asked, and he loved watching the changes in Thea's body, the roundness of her belly growing, the life they'd created together becoming more real with each passing day. On a warm May morning in 1887, with the doctor present and their nearest neighbor woman helping, Thea gave birth to a son. Jake held his wife's hand through the long labor, her grip crushing his fingers, her face set with determination. When the baby's first cry split the air, Jake felt tears stream down his face. "A boy," the doctor announced, placing the squirming, red-faced infant in Thea's arms. "Strong and healthy. He's perfect," Thea whispered, her face radiant despite her exhaustion. "Jake, look at him. He's absolutely perfect." Jake looked at his son, at the tiny fingers and the shock of dark hair and the unfocused eyes trying to make sense of this bright new world, and felt his heart expand beyond what he'd thought possible. "What should we name him?" Thea asked. They discussed names before, but now, looking at his son's face, Jake knew. "Thomas," he said, "after your father, Thomas Easton." Thea's eyes filled with tears. "You do that. Name him after my father. Your father built this homestead, built the life that brought you to the place where I found you. He taught you to be strong and compassionate and brave. I'd be honored to name our son after him." They called him Tommy, and he was a content baby who rarely cried and seemed fascinated by everything around him. Jake discovered depths of love he hadn't known he possessed, would spend hours just watching his son sleep or holding him while Thea rested. The homestead felt complete now, full of life and love and purpose. When Tommy was 6 months old, something unexpected happened. Thea was hanging laundry while Jake played with Tommy in the shade when she called out suddenly, "Jake, come look at this." He picked up Tommy and walked over to where Thea stood near the edge of their property, her hand shading her eyes as she stared toward the scrubland beyond. Jake followed her gaze and felt his breath catch. A red fox sat in the morning sunlight, watching them. It was too far to be certain, but Jake thought he saw a slight irregularity in how it held one hind leg. "You think it's," Thea breathed. "Could be," Jake said softly. More than 2 years later, and it came back. As if hearing them, the fox stood. And beside it, 3 smaller shapes emerged from the brush. Kits, their fur still the grayish color of youth, tumbling over each other in play. "She had babies," Thea said, wonder in her voice. "She survived and made a life and had babies." They watched the fox family for long minutes, the adult fox keeping watchful guard while her kits played. Then, as if satisfied with what she'd shown them, the mother fox gathered her young and led them away into the desert. "She wanted us to see," Thea said, wiping away tears. "She wanted us to know she made it." Jake pulled his wife and son close, his heart full beyond measure. Some stories have happy endings after all. The years flowed past like water, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Tommy grew into a bright, curious boy who shared his mother's love for animals and his father's sense of justice. He was 5 years old and helping his father repair a fence when a pregnant woman appeared on the road, exhausted and frightened, her horse nearly dead beneath her. Jake and Thea took her in immediately, no questions asked. Her name was Sarah, and she'd fled from an abusive husband in Texas, traveling alone through dangerous country to reach family in California. She stayed with them for 2 weeks while she and her horse recovered, and in that time, Thea and Jake both saw their own story reflected back at them. A vulnerable person needing protection, a choice to stand between her and harm. They sent her on to California with money, a fresh horse, and letters of introduction to people Jake knew along the route. 6 months later, they received a letter from her, full of gratitude and news that she'd safely reached her family and delivered a healthy daughter. "We make a difference," Thea said that night, reading the letter again by lamplight. "One person at a time, one animal at a time. It matters." "You taught me that," Jake reminded her. "That first day with the fox, you showed me that protecting one small, vulnerable thing can change everything." When Tommy was 7, Thea gave birth to twin daughters, Grace and Hope, who came into the world together just as they'd do everything else for the rest of their lives. Jake was overwhelmed with 3 children, especially 2 who worked in tandem to get into every kind of mischief possible, but he wouldn't have changed a thing. Tommy appointed himself his sister's protector, watching over them with fierce dedication. Jake saw himself in his son, the same instinct to stand between the vulnerable and harm. But he saw Thea there too, in the gentleness Tommy showed toward every living creature, the way he'd spend hours watching birds or helping nurse an injured rabbit back to health. The homestead expanded as their family grew. Jake built additions to the cabin, added more outbuildings, and they acquired more land. They were prosperous by frontier standards, not wealthy but comfortable, able to provide well for their children and still help others who needed it. Jake eventually took a position as the full-time sheriff of Wyatt, a role that let him stay closer to home while still serving justice. The town had grown considerably over the years, and it needed someone with his experience and temperament. Thea was proud of him, loved seeing him respected by the community, loved that their children grew up watching their father be a force for good in the world. On their 10th anniversary, Jake took Thea back to the canyon where they'd released the fox. They left the children with a trusted neighbor and rode out together in the early morning, the summer sun warm on their shoulders. "I wonder if she's still alive," Thea mused as they stood at the canyon's edge. "Foxes don't live terribly long in the wild." "Maybe not," Jake said, taking her hand. "But her kits are, and maybe they have kits of their own by now. The life you saved continues in them." "The life we saved," Thea corrected, the old argument they'd had many times before, always with smiles. "The life we saved," Jake conceded, "but you started it. You were the one willing to stand in front of a gun for a wounded fox. I just backed your play." "And kept backing it," Thea said softly. "Every day for 10 years. You've stood beside me through everything, Jake. The hard winters and the dry summers, the babies and the struggles, the wounded animals and the people who needed help. I couldn't have done any of it without you." "We're partners," Jake said simply. "In everything. That's how it works." They made love in the canyon that afternoon, in the shade of a cottonwood tree, reconnecting in the place where they'd let the fox go free. It felt right somehow, full circle, a renewal of everything they'd promised each other. Life continued its steady rhythm. Tommy grew into a teenager, tall and serious, interested in both ranching and law enforcement. The twins were 10 years old, inseparable as always, both of them sharp as tacks and twice as quick. Jake was 44 now, his hair showing gray at the temples, but he felt stronger than ever, rooted in the life he and Thea had built. One autumn evening, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Thea came to find Jake on the porch where he often sat watching the sunset. "I've been thinking," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "About what?" "About that first day. The fox, the men with guns, you riding up like something out of a storybook. If any one thing had been different, if I'd walked a different path or you'd ridden in another direction or those men had come an hour earlier, we never would have met. Our whole life together, Tommy and Grace and Hope, none of it would exist." Jake considered this. "But all those things did happen. We did meet. We fell in love and built this life together. Maybe that's not accident, Thea. Maybe that's fate." "Do you believe in fate?" "I believe that some things are meant to be," Jake said carefully. "And I believe that the choices we make matter. You chose to protect that fox. I chose to help you. We both chose each other over and over again. That's not accident or fate alone. That's us deciding every day that this is what we want." "And is it?" Thea asked, though her smile said she knew the answer. "Still what you want after all these years?" Jake pulled her close, kissing her temple. "More than ever. You're still the woman who'd stand between a gun and a helpless creature, still fierce and compassionate and brave, and I still fall in love with you new every morning." "Sweet talker," Thea murmured, but he felt her smile against his shoulder. "Only for you." They sat together as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, the land stretching away in all directions, beautiful and harsh and home. Somewhere out in the desert, foxes and coyotes and all manner of wild things went about their evening business. In the barn, their horses dozed peacefully. In the house behind them, their children slept safe and sound. It wasn't a perfect life. There were still hard days, sick animals they couldn't save, people they couldn't help, struggles with weather and money, and all the challenges of frontier living. But it was a good life, built on the foundation of that first moment when a woman had stood up for something vulnerable and a man had chosen to stand with her. That, Jake thought, was what love really was. Not the easy romantic moments, though those were sweet, but the choice to keep standing together, to keep protecting what mattered, to build something strong and good even when the world was hard. Years continued to pass, marked by the ordinary miracles of family life. Tommy, at 19, announced he wanted to become a deputy marshal like his father had been. Jake couldn't have been prouder, though Thea worried about the dangers. They compromised with Tommy working as a deputy in Wyatt first, learning under his father's supervision before venturing into the wider territory. The twins, at 16, were considering different paths. Grace wanted to be a teacher, fascinated by books and learning. Hope wanted to train horses, already showing an almost uncanny ability to understand and gentle even the most difficult animals. "She has your gift," Jake told Thea, watching Hope work with a skittish mare that had been abused by a previous owner. That same gentle patience, that ability to see what others miss. "She has yours too," Thea said. "That determination to protect those who can't protect themselves. She won't tolerate anyone mistreating an animal. Got into a fight last month with a boy twice her size because he was being cruel to a dog." "Who won?" Jake asked with a grin. "Who do you think?" Thea laughed. "She's our daughter. She won." On a spring day in 1904, when Jake was 50 and Thea was 48, they received an unexpected visitor. A young woman rode up to their homestead, well-dressed and educated-looking, clearly not from the immediate area. She introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Winters, and it took them a moment to place the name. "Winters," Thea said. "Are you related to my father? His name was Robert Winters." "I know," the young woman said with a smile. "I'm named after you. My mother was Sarah, the woman you helped when she was fleeing Texas 17 years ago. She named me after you, Mrs. Easton, to honor what you did for her." Thea's hands flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. "Sarah's daughter. But you said doctor." "Medical doctor," the young Sarah confirmed proudly. "I graduated from the Women's Medical College in Pennsylvania last year. My mother always told me that your compassion saved her life, and she wanted me to grow up understanding the importance of helping others. So I became a doctor." They invited her in, of course, and spent hours hearing about Sarah Sr.'s life, how she'd thrived in California, remarried a good man who treated her with respect, raised 4 children including this remarkable daughter who'd become a physician. "Mother wanted me to tell you," young Sarah said before she left, "that the kindness you showed her when she had nothing, when she was at her lowest point, it changed everything. She's never forgotten it, and neither will I. You gave her the chance to build a good life, and that life has reached more people than you know." After she left, Jake found Thea crying in their bedroom. "Happy tears?" he asked, holding her. "Yes," Thea said. "I just never knew. Never knew that helping her mattered so much, that it would ripple out like that. A doctor, Jake. She became a doctor because her mother taught her about compassion." "That's your legacy," Jake said softly. "Not just in our children, but in everyone you've helped. Every person, every animal. It all matters, Thea. It's all made a difference." As they entered their 60s, Jake and Thea began to slow down, though neither would admit it. Tommy had indeed become a marshal, working out of Santa Fe but visiting regularly. Grace was teaching in Wyatt's school, beloved by her students. And Hope had married a rancher's son, and was running one of the most successful horse breeding operations in the territory. Her reputation for gentle but effective training methods known throughout New Mexico. All three of their children had married and started families of their own, giving Jake and Thea 7 grandchildren who delighted them endlessly. The homestead rang with laughter when the whole family gathered, 3 generations sharing meals and stories and love. One evening, Jake and Thea sat on their porch as they'd done countless times before, watching the sunset paint the sky. They were older now, moving slower but still together, still in love, still choosing each other every day. "Do you remember," Thea said softly, "what you said to me that first day, after you'd helped me save the fox?" "I said a lot of things that day." "You said you'd come back, that you wanted to check on the fox, make sure I was all right, but really you came back because you wanted to see me." "Best decision I ever made," Jake said, taking her hand. Their fingers laced together automatically, worn smooth by decades of holding on. "I was so scared," Thea admitted. "Not of those men, but of what I felt when I looked at you. I'd been alone so long, had convinced myself I didn't need anyone. And then you showed up and suddenly I wanted everything I'd told myself I couldn't have." "What made you take the chance?" Thea thought about it. "You understood. When I said I'd stand between that fox and anyone who'd harm it, you didn't think I was crazy or sentimental. You understood that it mattered, that protecting vulnerable things was important, and I thought if he understands that, maybe he'll understand me too." "I did," Jake said. "I do. Every day I understand you better and love you more." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the land they'd worked together for so many years, the home they'd built, the legacy they'd created. Not in grand gestures or famous deeds, but in small acts of kindness repeated over a lifetime. In standing between the vulnerable and harm, in choosing compassion over cruelty, in building something good and strong and lasting. "Jake," Thea said as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, "if you had it to do over, would you change anything?" "Not one single thing," he said without hesitation. "Every moment led me to you, and everything since has been exactly what I wanted, even the hard parts, especially the hard parts because we faced them together." "I love you," Thea said simply, "from that first day until forever." "Forever," Jake agreed, pulling her close. "That's exactly what we've got." In the distance, a fox called out to the night, its voice high and wild and free. Jake smiled, wondering if it was a descendant of the animal they'd saved so long ago, if their small act of compassion had indeed continued down through generations. He liked to think so, liked to think that every choice to protect something vulnerable created ripples that spread further than anyone could see. The years were kind to them as they aged. They stayed healthy and active well into their 70s. Still working their land, though, with more help from their children and grandchildren now. The homestead had become something of a legend in the area, a place where wounded animals were welcome, where people in need could find help, where kindness was never in short supply. Jake retired fully from law enforcement at 70, ready to spend all his time with Thea and their ever-growing family. They had 14 grandchildren now, and 2 great-grandchildren, with more on the way. The little cabin they'd started in had been expanded and remodeled so many times it was barely recognizable. A sprawling ranch house that could accommodate the whole family when they gathered. On their 50th wedding anniversary, all 3 of their children organized a massive celebration. The whole town of Wyatt came, along with people from surrounding areas, all the lives Jake and Thea had touched over the decades. There were speeches and presents, and so much food the tables groaned under the weight. But Jake's favorite part was the quiet moment late in the day when just family remained. Tommy stood and raised his glass, his own children and grandchildren gathered around. 50 years ago, Tommy said, my parents made promises to each other. To love and honor and cherish in good times and bad, for richer or poorer, in sickness and health. They've kept those promises every single day since. But more than that, they've taught all of us what real love looks like. Not the easy, romantic kind you see in storybooks, but the kind that shows up every day, that protects the vulnerable, that builds something lasting through hard work and dedication and constant choice. He turned to look at his parents, his eyes shining. "Dad, you taught me that strength means standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. Mom, you taught me that compassion is never weakness, that protecting life in all its forms is the most important work there is. Together, you taught me that love is a verb, something you do every day, not just something you feel." Grace and Hope added their own words, thanking their parents for the examples they'd set, the values they'd instilled, the love they'd shown not just to their children but to everyone they encountered. By the time they finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. "Speech, Dad," Tommy called out, and the rest of the family took up the chant. Jake stood slowly, Thea's hand clasped in his. He looked around at all these faces, all these lives that had come from the choice he and Thea had made so long ago to stand together. "I'm not much for speeches," he started, and laughter rippled through the room because everyone knew he could talk when he wanted to. "But I'll say this. 50 years ago, I was a man who moved too fast to see what he was missing. I thought I was happy with my wandering life, thought I didn't need anything more. Then I heard a woman's voice cutting through a canyon, fierce and uncompromising, saying she'd protect a wounded fox even if it cost her everything." He looked down at Thea, saw the tears streaming down her face, saw the love that had only deepened over decades together. "That woman taught me what true courage looks like," Jake continued. "She taught me that compassion is the strongest force in the world, that choosing to protect the vulnerable even when it's hard or dangerous or inconvenient, that's what makes us human. She taught me how to love, really love, with everything I am. And she gave me a life so much richer and fuller than anything I could have imagined." He raised his glass. "To Thea, the bravest person I've ever known, and to all of you, the legacy of the love we built together. May you always remember to stand up for those who need standing up for, to choose compassion over cruelty, and to protect life in all its forms. That's what matters. That's what lasts." The toast rang out through the room and Jake sat down again, pulling Thea close. She was crying openly now, and he kissed away her tears, not caring that their entire family was watching. "Still making me cry after 50 years, she said with a watery laugh. "It's one of my few talents," Jake replied, making her laugh harder. They danced that night, moving slowly to music played by their grandchildren, surrounded by everyone they loved. Jake held Thea close and thought about that first moment he'd seen her, kneeling in the dirt protecting a wounded fox with nothing but her body and her fierce determination. He'd known then, even if he hadn't admitted it to himself, that she was someone special, someone worth changing his entire life for, and he'd been right. Everything good in his life, everything that mattered, had come from the choice to stand with her that day and every day since. As they moved into their 80s, Jake and Thea finally slowed down significantly. They spent most of their time on the porch now, watching their grandchildren and great-grandchildren play in the yard, telling stories of the old days, and simply being together. They'd earned their rest, everyone agreed, after lifetimes of service to their community and each other. Thea's health began to fail first. Nothing dramatic, just the gradual wearing down of a body that had worked hard for 8 decades. She tired more easily, moved more slowly, but her mind stayed sharp as ever, and her capacity for love never diminished. Jake cared for her with the same gentle dedication she'd shown to countless wounded creatures over the years. He helped her dress, prepared her meals, read to her from her beloved books, and held her hand through the increasingly frequent pains. Their children wanted to help, but Jake insisted on doing most of it himself. "I promise to love you in sickness and in health," he said when Tommy tried to hire a nurse. "I'm keeping that promise." One spring morning, with the desert blooming in rare profusion after good winter rains, Thea asked Jake to help her out to the porch. She wanted to see the sunrise, she said, wanted to feel the morning air on her face. They sat together wrapped in blankets as the sun painted the sky in glorious colors. The land stretched away before them, beautiful and wild and home. In the distance, Jake saw a flash of red, a fox moving through the sage brush. It paused and seemed to look back at them for a moment before disappearing. "Did you see?" Thea whispered, her voice weak but wondering. "I saw," Jake confirmed, his arm around her shoulders. "All these years," she said softly. "All these animals we've helped, all these lives we've touched. It mattered, didn't it, Jake? We made a difference." "The biggest difference," he assured her. "You showed me how to love, Thea, how to really love with everything I am. That's changed everything for me and for everyone we've touched. That kind of love ripples out forever." Thea sighed contentedly, leaning into his embrace. "I'm tired, Jake. I know, my love, I know. But I'm so happy. So grateful for every day we've had together, every choice that led us to each other, every moment of this beautiful life." "Me too," Jake said, his voice breaking. "Me too, Thea." She was quiet for a long time, and Jake thought she might have fallen asleep. But then she spoke again, so soft he had to lean close to hear. "That fox," she murmured. "That first day, you asked me why I'd protect it so fiercely. Do you remember what I said? You said if they harmed it, they harmed you too." "I meant it," Thea said. "All vulnerable things, all creatures that need protecting, they're all connected to us. Harm done to them is harm done to our own souls. But the opposite is true too, Jake. Every act of protection, every choice to stand between the vulnerable and harm, that heals us. That makes us more whole. You understood that even then. That's why I loved you." "I love you too," Jake said, tears streaming down his face now. "So much, Thea, more than words can say." "I know," she whispered. "I've always known, just like you've always known how much I love you." She took one more shaky breath, looking out over the land they'd loved together for so long, and then she was still. Jake held her as the sun rose fully, bathing them both in golden light, and felt his heart break and heal simultaneously. She was gone, but the love remained, stronger than death, eternal as the land itself. The funeral was the largest Wyatt had ever seen. People came from all over New Mexico and beyond, lives that Thea had touched over her 84 years. They told stories of her kindness, her fierce protection of the vulnerable, her unwavering compassion even in the hardest circumstances. They talked about the animals she'd saved, the people she'd helped, the example she'd set. Jake listened to it all, surrounded by his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and felt proud beyond measure of the woman he'd loved. She'd been extraordinary, and now everyone could see what he'd known from that very first day. After Thea's death, Jake declined rapidly. Everyone could see it, the way he seemed to fade without her. He still smiled for his family, still told stories to the great-grandchildren, but something essential had dimmed in him. Tommy tried to get him to eat more, to take better care of himself, but Jake just shook his head. "I'm 86 years old," he said gently. "I've had a good life, a full life, more than I ever deserved, and I'm tired, son. So tired. I'm ready to rest." "But we need you," Tommy protested, though he understood. He'd seen the depth of love between his parents all his life. Some bonds were so strong that breaking them meant breaking the people themselves. "You have me," Jake assured him. "All the lessons, all the love, All the values your mother and I taught you. That's what lasts, Tommy. That's what never dies. 6 months after Thea's death, on a cool autumn morning, Jake passed away quietly in his sleep. His family found him in the bed he'd shared with Thea for over 50 years, a peaceful expression on his face and a photograph of her clutched in his hand. They buried him beside Thea on a hill overlooking the homestead, under a stand of cottonwood trees they'd planted together decades before. The whole family gathered, 4 generations strong, and as they said their goodbyes, a red fox appeared at the edge of the gathering. It sat quietly through the service, watching, and then disappeared back into the sage brush. "They came," Hope said wonderingly. "Even after all these years, the foxes came to say goodbye." Tommy nodded, too moved to speak. It felt right, somehow fitting. His parents had started their love story protecting a vulnerable creature, and the descendants of that creature had come to honor them in death. In the years that followed, the homestead stayed in the family, passed down through the generations just as Jake and Thea's values were passed down. It became a kind of sanctuary, a place where wounded animals were still welcome, where people in need could still find help, where the legacy of 2 people who'd chosen compassion over cruelty lived on. Tommy's granddaughter eventually wrote a book about Jake and Thea's life, using letters and journals and the stories she'd heard from her grandfather. It became surprisingly popular, resonating with people who were tired of cruelty and violence, who wanted to be reminded that goodness still mattered, that standing up for the vulnerable could change the world. The dedication reads simply, "To Jake and Thea Easton, who taught their family that love means protecting those who cannot protect themselves, whether that's a wounded fox or a frightened person or any of God's creatures who need standing up for. Your legacy of compassion lives on in all of us." And it did live on, rippling out through generations, touching more lives than Jake and Thea could have ever imagined that first day when a marshal heard a woman's fierce declaration and chose to stand with her. They'd built something lasting from that moment, something stronger than stone or steel, a legacy of love and protection and unwavering compassion that would endure long after they were gone. Because that's what real love does. It creates, it protects, it endures. It stands between the vulnerable and harm, over and over again, no matter the cost. It recognizes that every living thing has value, that every act of compassion matters, that choosing kindness in a cruel world is the bravest thing anyone can do. Jake and Thea had understood that from the beginning, and they'd spent their entire lives proving it true. Their story was extraordinary not because of grand gestures or dramatic moments, but because of the steady, daily choice to love fiercely and protect faithfully, to build something good in a hard world, to create a legacy that would outlast them both. And in the end, that's all any of us can hope for. To love well, to protect what's vulnerable, to leave the world a little better than we found it, and to build something that matters, something that lasts, something that ripples out through time, touching lives we'll never know about in ways we can't imagine. That was Jake and Thea's gift to the world, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.